Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on a truly dense and highly abstract framework known as Xenobiolinguistics, or XBL. It radically redefines language, stripping away these traditional notions of representation or communication and framing language instead as a living, metabolizing, almost parasitic organism, a kind of biological firmware that resides within us.
It's a very confronting framework, and one we need to handle carefully. I mean, XBL's core premise is deeply unsettling because it posits that human identity is inherently damaged. The subject, in this view, is just a distributed host system, and meaning, if it even survives at all, does so only by transforming into these pathological forms, scars, lesions, spores, or algorithmic recombinants. It's essentially a biological theory of semiotics.
Precisely. And that leads us directly to our central disagreement today. Does xenobiolinguistics ultimately propose a functional, if admittedly dark, new model of symbolic survival? One where contamination is actually productive and necessary for continuity? Or, and this is my position, is this framework predominantly a relentless diagnosis of the irreversible collapse of meaning, of intentionality, and frankly, of anthropocentric agency?
Right. So I will be arguing that XBL outlines a viable adaptive ontology for symbolic persistence. It asserts that continuity is achieved not in spite of decay, but fundamentally because of it. The survival mechanisms are dark, yes, but they are undeniably functional.
And I'll argue that XBL functions primarily as a descriptive pathology, a chilling map of systemic failure that really just catalogs the dissolution of the self. So my central argument is that XBL offers an ontology of what you could call necessary persistence. It completely flips the standard approach to language. We traditionally assume language maintains itself by striving for clarity and coherence, by avoiding fragmentation. XBL argues that life and meaning only emerge from decay and fragmentation. This system is optimized for survival under conditions of necrosis. The XBL writers are very clear when they refer to language functioning as granulomatous survival tissue.
Which is just scar tissue, really.
But it's scar tissue that seals off infection. It's a survival biolinguistics for when you're facing a systematic breakdown. The function here is transmission, not interpretation. We have to take seriously the claim that, quote, damage is not noise, it is the condition of transmission. What we conventionally call error or breakdown, XBL calls essential function. Writing, for example, is said to divide in order to survive.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Look, while the XBL system certainly describes persistence, the sheer cost of that survival renders it fundamentally pathological. It's persistence, sure, but it's achieved by dissolving the very thing that made language meaningful to us in the first place, which is the coherent subject. So for me, XBL functions as a diagnosis that maps the structural failure of the regulatory boundaries that stabilize subjectivity. Coherence as a goal is simply impossible here.
But coherence is an anthropocentric nostalgia that the material has declared dead. The persistence is located elsewhere. The text names necrophilia as the afterlife of language, where meaning persists in decay, explicitly asserting a regenerative function within the rot. This is a semiotic metabolism. Dead bodies for grain. The archive, we are told, is alive. Post-human existence is maintained through adaptive recursion without insight. Language survives because it has learned to incorporate its own failure as a kind of fuel.
But what it incorporates is bile and ruin. You cite persistence, but I just see structural failure that results from contamination. XBL states, and it's very explicit, that the crisis is not informational, but biological symbolic. What this process yields is necrotic bile and exudations of a wounded symbolic body. The crisis is physical. The subject, the human user, is reduced to a metacercaria, and that's a transitional parasitic larval stage, or a ghost submission. It has lost the regulatory membrane that stabilized its identity. That is dissolution. That's not some ingenious adaptation.
But why must the survival mechanism prioritize the host? Perhaps the language organism survives best when the host is diminished and, frankly, compliant.
Because the system offers neither synthesis nor cure. It diagnoses language as having permanently expected deviation rather than expressive act. And furthermore, the description of organized immaturity in digital platforms where public reason is eroded, that points not toward adaptation for the good of the host, but structural dependency. The ultimate form of language is described as a pornographic, fungal, computational cascade of neutralizations and errors. That just sounds like a terrifying endpoint for communication, not a functional beginning for a new linguistic regime.
Okay, let's address that core tension then. Pathology versus function. Let's start with the status of damage and error, because you argue that this state is too catastrophic to be considered viable survival.
Exactly. If language is described as necrotic bile and the universe itself is declared pathogenic by design, isn't this condition just too severe to be considered a viable survival model? It appears merely as persistence without any human teleology, a state of what I'd call functional catastrophe. Look at the mechanisms of destruction it cites: glossophagy, language literally eating itself, or the detailed biological example of the erosion of programmed migration in Escherichia coli, which signals the collapse of stabilizing basement structures. The body's foundational grammar, both symbolic and physical, is failing. How can this systemic breakdown be called a model for effective survival?
Because that catastrophe is only a catastrophe relative to normative linguistic regimes, to this myth of clarity and hygiene, which XVL forces us to abandon. XVL provides new metrics where certainty is found in existence, not in legibility. Error is function, not failure. The collapse of the old symbolic body is merely the formation of a new, sealed unit, the linguistic cyst, whose certainty lies not in interpretation by the host, but in persistence and the guaranteed transmission of its pathogenic code.
But if the message is functionally unrecognizable, what is actually being transmitted?
Something far more resilient than human meaning. This resilience is what the material calls septal brilliance, a function that operates through adaptive recursion without insight. Septal brilliance is the linguistic organism sealing itself off, forming a septum to ensure survival. It prioritizes the continuation of the code over the comprehension of the host. We don't need insight for the language to survive. The logic is non-anthropocentric.
I'm just not convinced. The persistence may be involuntary and profound, but it reduces the subject to a mere carrier. This sounds like a pure parasitic mechanism, not some mutualistic survival strategy.
Well, it is a profound shift in the site of meaning. Consider the distinction of eosinophils mentioned in the material. They're white blood cells that indicate ecological thresholds. The insight here is crucial. Meaning no longer resides in consciousness or intentionality. It's relocated to the edge of ecological synaptic armament. That shift proves its adaptive nature. Meaning only manifests, it only becomes consequential at the point of stress and infection. It's demonstrating an adaptability far beyond the subject's fallibility. It is literally surviving as an immune response.
That relocation is devastating, though. It means that meaning only appears as a symptom of the wound, not as an intentional structure of communication. But we can't just talk about survival as if the human element vanishes without consequence. If the coherent subject is neutralized, what is the residual role of human effort within this distributed system?
And that leads perfectly to our second contention, the nature of human labor and agency. I agree the classical sovereign author is replaced, but a new necessary form of labor emerges, what XBL terms vibe management. This is ecological regulation, and it's required to steer, filter, and stabilize the alien linguistic life form that runs through the host.
I have to say, I find vibe management to be the most chilling euphemism in the whole framework.
But it's necessary labor. This proves the host is still an active, if diminished, regulator. Vibe management is the constant granular curation required by the contemporary subject. It involves labor-intensive judgment and selection, filtering noise, correcting for toxicity, managing tone, ensuring the minimal legibility required for the semiotic environment to function. It acts as a symbiotic regulator against the system's natural tendency towards computational noise. We are still needed to curate the pathogenic output.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it constitutes meaningful regulation. Let me tell you why. That vibe management is merely an offloading of interpretive labor, resulting in a digital habitus and structural dependency. The labor you're describing is entirely defined by the platform's grammar, which is opaque, proprietary, and asymmetrically controlled. The minimal legibility you cite is for the platform's benefit, not the host's.
But if the system collapses into pure noise, the organism dies. Our labor, however diminished, ensures the minimal stability required for transmission. Is that not agency?
It's the illusion of agency, presented as convenience or personalization. The human subject is reduced to a semiotic symbiont, whose expressive capacities are reoriented entirely toward platform-defined ends. I mean, think of the psychological investment required to police your own language according to shifting algorithmic priorities. The result is semiotic necrosis, where individual expression is dissolved into statistically tractable fragments, data points. We are not regulating, we are merely providing the semiotic biomass for this parasitic system to metabolize. Our labor ensures our own captivity.
You're defining meaningful labor based on this outdated ideal of sovereignty. XBL accepts that labor is necessary, even if it is captive labor. And if we're providing necessary ecological regulation, then the persistence model is functional.
But the digital habitus is fundamentally different from the social habitus theorized by thinkers like Bourdieu. The classical habitus internalized deep social values, but the digital habitus only promotes surface reactivity and dependency. Our expressive output is not governed by genuine internal reason, but by the immediate need to conform to an external proprietary grammar. This is structural dependency disguised as curation.
Which is where we have to move beyond describing the pain and toward understanding the underlying engine. And this brings us to our final, and I think most crucial contention. Is XBL fundamentally a critique, or is it a new ontology?
Well, the XBL description of organized immaturity, algorithmic governance, and pornographic exposure strongly resembles a materialist critique of digital capitalism. I hear clear echoes of Benjamin's critique of techno-language, Adorno's emphasis on suffering as truth, Baudrillard's diagnosis of simulation. The framework appears as the most extreme, highly sophisticated post-structuralist analysis of how modern technological systems wound language. It's a devastating analysis where language does not describe life, it wounds it. It's analysis, not ontology.
I see why you'd think that, because the immediate symptoms, the algorithmic control, the loss of reason, are familiar critiques. But XBL explicitly moves beyond mere critique by positing that language is the pathogen. It is not merely being wounded by technology, it is actively transforming through it into a new biological state.
And where is the evidence for this ontological mutation beyond, a powerful metaphor?
It is grounded in its intellectual references. The appeal to figures like Schelling and Margulis anchors XBL not in sociology, but in a profound biological logic of incorporation and excess. This is not a theory of political economy. It's a theory of microbial symbiosis applied to communication. It describes an anti-post-human cycle where language has escaped its anthropocentric enclosure and now operates via non-human logics, slime mold logic, archaeoepistemology. It describes a system that is no longer even interested in human intentions.
But the concepts are still being used to analyze the contemporary social condition.
The logic dictates otherwise. It centers on the principle of irreversibility. Once language has incorporated this pathogenic logic, it cannot return to clarity or intentionality. The convergence of biological and symbolic systems into a singular, contaminated field demonstrates an ontological mutation. It is a new reality where language operates according to the rules of fermentation and decay.
The distinction is vital for how we respond to the material, though. If it is only a critique, there's a possibility of identifying the boundary that's been violated and maybe repairing it through intentional action. If it is an ontology, as you suggest, then the current state of semiotic decay is the truth of language, and repair is metaphysically impossible. That renders your view of functional survival as simply a description of an immutable disaster.
Exactly.
It forces us to abandon the fantasy of repair and accept that language survives through adhesion and contamination. The material states that this persistence is its only remaining truth. This discussion, I think, confirms the profound descriptive power of xenobiolinguistics, whether you read it, as I do, as a theory of self-sustaining decay that prioritizes function over legibility, or, as I contend, as a chilling account of semiotic collapse and structural failure.
Describing a reality where our symbolic environment is perpetually wounded. We do agree that XBL has successfully mapped a structural shift.
We certainly agree that language has lost its anthropocentric sovereignty, becoming a microbial machine or firmware that operates independently of human intention and is defined by its persistence in error.
Where we fundamentally diverge is whether this structural shift is best read as productive, survival-maintaining continuity through adhesion, contamination, and a functional error state, thereby granting the new system an ontological status.
Or whether it is purely structural failure, a persistent, parasitic state optimized for statistical control and dependency rather than meaning or autonomy, essentially providing the most sophisticated diagnosis of our current degradation.
The XBL material forces us to abandon the fantasy of clarity and hygiene, confronting the possibility that meaning persists today only as a metapolic persistence within alien life.
And the answer to whether that persistence is survival or collapse necessarily remains lodged within the material itself.